So I've been working with children in a community in a Caribbean island. And when Bruce asked me to come and think about adolescence, I figured it was probably about time, because those kids, those of you who are parents know that kids don't stay kids. They do go into adolescence. I'm in the thick of it now with my own. The other thing is, when you work in the same community for a long time, the community becomes part of you. And what started out as basic research now becomes community-driven research, because you become very sensitive to what the people in your community want. What do they want you to work on? What are their questions, and how can you help them answer them? And adolescence is very important for them. And they're seeing a big change. When I started working in this village, there was no running water. We had to get all our water from streams. There was no electricity. Most everything was done by hand and foot. There was a donkey path to the village. Now we have electricity. We got piped water a couple years ago. There's a fine road that comes to the village. Some people have TVs, so there's been a huge shift. And one of the shifts that the people in the village are especially concerned with is not so much the influx of technology, because everybody loves a shower and a light that you can turn on instead of kerosene lamp. But the shift in social power, particularly when it comes to adolescence. The change in the way 15, 16, 17-year-olds act. The respect that they used to have for their elders. The increasing amounts of what folks call disobedience. Huge change in those areas. And I'm really interested in them, in part because it's a very interesting scientific problem, but also because the people in that community are interested in it. What I'm going to present today is an initial stab at my trying to understand some of these things. And I'm going to fly through some stuff. I apologize, especially to Candace. There's no way you're going to be able to take notes on this.
I record you.
I'm going to go into hyper mode. And you know, the initial thing I'm going to go through very quickly to just try and set the stage. And then I've got a few interesting empirical tidbits at the end where I'm trying to work with looking at adolescents, some of whom have been identified by folks in the village as having a number of problem behaviors, and comparing them to those that don't. These are some of my favorite molecules. They have tremendous effects on how we see the world. Beautiful fall day here in Tucson. Our dopamine levels are probably surging a little bit. Great stuff. This, if you could see him, is my youngest son a long time ago. And I'm not using him as a prop for the greatest mind that's ever existed. He's just my son. But some of the questions we have about the mind and what it's evolved to do, I think, are really central and core to some of the questions we're trying to answer here. Thankfully, Carol made a lot of my argument about the social brain for me, so I can probably skip over large parts of that. The other reason I'm showing him here for a prop is that he's had an effect on me. My oxytocin, my AVP levels have surged a bit, maybe even prolactin. Testosterone levels here are shriveled down, perhaps. I'm addicted to my son. And that's a fairly significant human evolved characteristic. This chimpanzee is very cute too. If I were a chimpanzee father, I would not have had the same kinds of changes in my hormone levels. So one of the key things that's happened in human evolution is a change in the patterns of the hormones that influence our behavior, particularly in regard to paternal attachment to offspring. Now there's some other key areas that are very important as well about hormonal control of behavior in human evolution. And in particular, understanding some of the transitions in human life history. We're a little bit unusual in having such altricial infants that are so mentally precocial, particularly in regards to acquiring information. They set up language and get this enormous fiber optic conduit to their brains so they can absorb information from the environments around them. We have a very long childhood and period of adolescence, and then we have this interesting post-reproductive period, including menopause. When we look at adolescence, it's the shift in growth, somatic effort, to reproduction. And the brain has got some really interesting new different problems now when we make this transition. And doing them earlier is pretty costly. I mean, getting pregnant isn't one of those things you can do 20%. And so, the transition to reproduction, reproductive effort, reproductive competition is a fairly significant precipice with some pretty rapid changes that are going on. And associated with this are risks that we've all seen and talked about in males competing for mates. Females, I'm not sure I'm going to call pregnancy a risk, but under the wrong circumstances, you don't have the right resources or social support, it's not going to be optimal to reproduce under those circumstances. Modern environments have novel risks. Think about what our brains have evolved to deal with, things like predators, competing with other folks, that sorts of things. In modern environments, we've got fast cars, World of Warcraft, these peer groups that have great importance, a lot of isolation from our kin networks, our traditions, parenting that has changed quite a bit, all of which may be intersecting with some of these important transitions during adolescence that can result in some of the problems I think we're here for, to try and resolve. I want to take you now to my study site in the Caribbean, the village that I call Boma. This is a view out my office window.
Nice.
It is a beautiful place. As you can see, the relief is rather extreme. People there are extremely fit because they have to be walking up and down these hills and doing all the labor they do. It's relatively isolated. I've been there a long time, as I mentioned. I'm not experimenting with the children. It's a naturalistic study. Basically, we watch the children, follow the children in their everyday activities. It includes all the kids in the village. We collect a lot of anthropological data, a lot of medical data, psychological data, but the thing I'm kind of renowned for is all this saliva I've collected. So day after day, we're collecting saliva from these children. From the saliva, we can monitor hormone levels. In particular, the one I've been most interested in has been cortisol, a stress hormone. But I'm going to present some data that I'm not really very comfortable with on some androgens, testosterone. I figure that's partly what a workshop gives you the opportunity to do, is push yourself in places that maybe the ice is pretty thin and get some good feedback. So following the kids around, doing their chores, playing King of the Mountain on the rock, taking care of their siblings, working in the garden, terrorizing the anthropologist by coming down a path at 1,000,000 miles an hour when he's trying to carry his saliva samples home. Day after day, week after week, year after year. Putting all this together, this is a random, really was a random tube I pulled out. You need the child's name, the time that you're collecting it, the time the child woke up. There's some very important circadian things you need to control for, and lots of hormones that you're looking at. And then basically what's going on in that child's life. One of the most important things we do is talk to the children, talk to the children, talk to the children, because you need to know how they see things, not just how you're seeing things. So sitting down and talk to them. Here are the same two girls, same doorstep. This is actually the same doorstep where I would interview their mother before they were even born. Very quick story in terms of the source of stress as we measure it by elevated cortisol levels. It's primarily social issues in the family. If we look at stability of cortisol profiles, most kids are fairly stable. About as many will have occasional blips up, and these are year-to-year-to-year composites. And usually there's something going on in those years. Not always. Sometimes we're surprised, like, what was going on there, and nobody's got an explanation for it. And then there'll be some years where we thought the child should have had elevated cortisol levels, and they don't. And then some children exhibit what we think might be a significant long-term change. I was particularly interested in these kids to see if there was a traumatic event that had happened, which then caused this permanent change. There's an issue in the literature as to whether or not exposure to significant traumatic events then influences basically the mechanisms for the negative feedback loop and the control of the stress hormone cortisol that I'm looking at. And I'm going to make a complex story real quick here. The answer is we don't have good support for that. All the examples we have where children have permanent, what looks like a permanent elevated levels of cortisol and erratic levels of cortisol that are generally associated with problems that are going on, have got a persistent social stressor in their environment. So it doesn't look like it's the mechanisms for the regulation of the stress hormone, but rather something that's continuing in their environment that's causing what we're seeing in terms of cortisol levels. Looking at factors that are important for ameliorating consequences of early stress, kin support, grandmothers primarily. If you've got a lot of allo parents, people that are really helping you out that you could go to, those children have cortisol levels that are not different from kids that haven't had exposure to early trauma. This is going to be one of my candidates for 10 simple truths. Grandparents. And we don't know as much about grandparents as I think we need to. We don't know what the mechanisms are that cause grandparents to fall in love with their children, to become addicted to them in much the same way that parents do, and whether or not there's some interesting differences in that context. Turning to emotional regulation, I'm going to give you a quick little video here. Hopefully this might be too much volume. Are there other people in the building that are going to get freaked out? No. Are we safe? Okay. I'm not going to show you a video from my village. Kids wouldn't like that. This is one of my... nice exhibition of temper tantrum. Social audience. A great message for undergraduates. When we look at the cortisol response to tantrums, most of the time the kids are faking it in terms of their physiology. There's no rise in cortisol to this. And when we do see it, there's usually this really interesting dynamic that's going on between the child and the parent, where the parent as I read it, is doing something that the child has not predicted. And this is then causing a rise in the child's cortisol. Admittedly, too, I mean, you get some physical things that are going to elevate your cortisol at some point here. But that's basically what's going on. There's some really interesting stuff in terms of the ontogeny here. Usually kids get over their temper tantrums pretty early on. Some don't. In the context in which we see adolescent males having tantrums, not really this sort, more sort of anger displays, are pretty interesting. And there's some interesting sex differences here, where males show these aggressive anger displays to their enemies, and females do not. And I don't have a really good explanation for this just yet.
Who are their enemies, quickly? Within the same village?
Yes, within the same village.
Okay.
Within the same village. And enemies is, you know, they're self-defined by these kids. A really important thing that's going on in human evolution is the development of pretty sophisticated coalitions. Other species like chimps, dolphins, elephants have big brains. Coalitions seem to be associated with this. We're especially unusual in this regard because we form coalitions and we live in these large groups with lots of males and lots of females, and we each have our sort of nested family units, and that's really unusual. I think emotional regulation in that context is something that's a really key, significant evolutionary development for humans. Here, one of the modes of competition, team competition, coalitionary competition, is cricket. And I'm going to show you some hormone response to coalitionary events. This is the world's most beautiful cricket field. There's a huge home field advantage to it as well, as you might imagine. You know where you're going to break your ankle and where you're not. Move on from that. A typical effect in human males to victory is elevating your testosterone. And often when you've suffered a loss, to a diminished level of testosterone. And we see this pretty reliably. I would like to have better data on this than I do, but from what I've been able to pull out, rather incidentally, it's pretty straightforward. On the other hand, and this is probably something that's unique to humans, if you look at competition within coalitions, sorry, with the lighting here, you really can't see what's going on very well, but rather than with the victory, the elevation of T, you don't get it.
This is within village versus between village?
Either way.
This is within village? Or
most of this is within village, but some of it is also between village, and you see the same thing. In the village, there's different hamlets, and there are different sort of neighborhoods that are competitive with other neighborhoods, and when they're competing against each other, there are some differences. It's not just physical competition. Dominoes is another favorite competitive activity. We get the same thing, and here we're looking at dyads competing against each other. Very typical scene.
These are guys we're talking about.
We're talking about guys. I have not looked at girls for this. I had a graduate student who did that with bike racing, and it was kind of interesting, but that's neither here nor there. Same thing. When you defeat your friends, your T levels do not go up. Another interesting thing that humans have to deal with is interacting with females in your group, and some of those females you might be attracted to. And one typical result of that, if you could see this a little better, you'd see my son and his friend in this house, is what I would call the Roney effect after Jim Roney, who did some interesting work with this. Basically, exposure to a nubile female, typical male, will elevate his testosterone. I would guess this is a rather unique and special human adaptation involving respect for the mating relationships of others.
What's the time span between
You
seeing
know,
it and
yeah, what I need is to replicate sort of Jim Roney's thing where, you know, I've got a before and then an after, but, you know, when I was collecting saliva samples, it wasn't designed for this.
Okay.
So I'm just pulling them out from when they were with the mate, had been with the mate of a close friend, and when they'd been with some other woman. You know, here are their typical levels when they weren't engaged in that situation. I've got a few case examples, you know, where I had an hour, next hour, and we had an event, and they fit with this. But the sample size is just too small. Okay, that's pretty much background information for what I'm going to get to here, which is looking at adolescents, some of whom are identified as having a lot of problem behaviors. Here we've got my son. He's playing a video game. You know, he's in this beautiful Caribbean village, and what's he doing? He's playing a video game. His father considered that to be a problem behavior. That's not what people in the village identify as problem behaviors, but here we go. In terms of family environment, there's some interesting differences in that you kind of get weighted towards this end in the adolescents that were identified as having problem behaviors. Kin support, and this isn't a direct measure of it, like how much, you know, actual help was going back and forth. This is just your average relatedness to everyone else that's alive in the village. And the problem behavior adolescents have fewer kin ties. They're more coming from the outside than the adolescents who weren't identified as having had these problem behaviors. The stability of the cortisol, we had more in the major change and variable in the problem-based adolescents than in the controls. Response to anger events, I don't know how to interpret this. I thought it would go the other way, but the problem-based, the problem behavior adolescents had lower average cortisol levels. I mean, you know, they had higher than you would have expected
Well, I mean, that's not
at random. Pardon?
I mean, that's not inconsistent necessarily with the hyporeactivity
It's
model.
not. And you can't quite see these black numbers in here. One thing is that the incidence of anger events is higher in the problem behavior adolescents than it is in the controls, but their cortisol response to these events is less. Maybe they've habituated. You know, maybe it's a more common thing for them. The temper tantrum kids, you know, following them into adolescence, the ones that have less of a cortisol response during the temper tantrums are more likely to end up in this problem behavior group, but I've yet to figure out an appropriate statistic that's sort of, you know, my read on that one. We don't see the effects that I just showed you in terms of response to competition. So, you know, a victory is a victory. Whether you're beating your friends or you're beating your non-friends, you elevate your T levels for the adolescents with problem behavior. And similarly, in regard to interacting with your friends' mates, we don't see that diminishment of cortisol either. You know, is this part of not having acquired, you know, socially appropriate responses? Still having a certain kind of competitiveness that maybe is not conducive to pro-social behavior? Interesting question. One last little bit here. This is my postdoc, Davide Ponzi, and he's been running a lot of, he's been asking the kids about their social networks and having them do public good games to sort of see how they develop cooperative behaviors. And we're going to match how the children perform in these testing of their social competencies and seeing how they view their social worlds and in terms of who their friends are and what the social networks are, what their attitudes are towards sharing and cooperating, and then some of the hormone profiles that we've seen. To summarize, looking at adolescent males, they usually have diminished T response to victory over friends, as do adult males. So, I'm looking at adolescents thinking, here's a transition period where they're developing some of these characteristics they're going to need as adults. The adolescents that had problem behaviors do not exhibit that. Similarly, in regard to the interaction with friends, mates, we weren't getting the same response with the adolescents that had problem behaviors. My read on some of these things, I think there's some really interesting stuff that is going to be fun to research in regard to understanding coalitional behavior and these remarkable traits that humans have of empathy and trust, and seeing what kind of transitions occur in those relationships during adolescence. And also, because I've been so interested in kids, kind of seeing how that prior history sets them up for that. I'm also getting really interested in being able to look at some of the changes in the affiliative hormones and seeing what's going on with that in terms of setting up their relationships. It's a new tool. Previously we couldn't look at these things, but now we're getting some techniques to be able to evaluate those hormones. And in terms of my quick and simple synopsis here, I don't think I'm making some very strong arguments to try and get my stuff up there into any of the top 3 positions, but my read on what's important in adolescence, having grandparents can support that sense of order is very important. I think understanding these hormonal mechanisms, how they develop, how they influence the way our brain understands what's going on in our social environments, that's going to be really important stuff. And then getting a better understanding of coalitional biology and the mechanisms that underpin it, I think will also be really important. I have lots of people to thank. I won't go through them all, but the folks in the village have just been so wonderful to me. I always feel super indebted there. And I guess I can
Okay, that was great. So let's have a question. Let's have a few questions for Mark, and then we'll open it up to the last few afternoon speakers. Yeah.
Mark, so the annual measures of cortisol that were taken among the youth who have elevated levels, prolonged elevated levels,
right.
seem to be ongoing because of some ongoing stressor,
Yep.
as opposed to some short-term acute stressors. What were some of those ongoing stressors, the more prominent?
Yeah, they included situations, primarily situations in the family that were abusive.
Okay.
Either physical abuse or sexual abuse.
Please be sure to speak up for everyone.
Yeah, the question was, what were some of the persistent long-term stressors for children? And the primary source there was abusive situations in their houses. In a couple circumstances, death of a parent involved something where it didn't get resolved for them, so it continued to be a source of stress. The environment had a big hole in it.
Agent?
Do you believe that the aberrant or unusual coalitional endocrinology of these kids was a cause, if I may say it that way, of their problem behavior, or might it have been the result of their social ostracism and secondary, so they feel alienated from that group?
That's a great question. I mean, that's part of the question I have. That's part of the question when I get Davide to kind of work his way up into adolescence. And so, you know, it's the cause and effect dance here between hormonal response and behavior, and how children perceive the environment, how adolescents perceive the environment. I guess it's both. We think we can get a window into this because some of the kids that exhibit problem behaviors are part of a significant tight coalition. My guess is there might be some interesting contrasts here between coalitions in a traditional village like this as compared to, say, the circumstance that Bruce talked about in Chicago. There are going to be some parallels, but there are going to be some significant differences as well.
Okay. Jay and then Tony. Jay?
Quick question. You get, these are kids as high as old as 15 to 17. You getting any data on their sexual behavior, who's sexually active, and how that plays into any of this?
Yeah. One of my former graduate students, Rob Quinlan, he and I have an NSF together, and part of what he's doing is collecting data on the onset of sexual behavior. And yeah, at some point we're going to link these, but at this point, if you had a specific question, you know, I could give you some case examples.
Well, for example, which girls are more versus less sexually active, as opposed to their developmental histories, as opposed to perhaps their endocrine profile, you know, their hormone profiles, anything. Given you know the conference on the workshops on teenage pregnancy and that kind of some sex risk taking, I'm just curious.
The changes that have happened sort of socially, culturally over the last 10 years have such a greater influence on adolescent female sexuality. That
Constraining it or opening it up?
Opening it up. So now we have 15, 16-year-old girls that are basically having sex to get time on their cell phones. You know, that never happened.
But there's still individual differences. And, well,
yes, there are.
Well, there's more sex.
Yes, there are. But you know, for me to, I can do it. But you know, when you know you compare two girls, one of you know that are not at the same
point in time, right?
Point in time,
okay, right.
You've got that huge difference in the culture there. So you know, it's a relatively small village.
Yeah.
And I run into problems.
So a 15-year-old today and a 15-year-old 5 years ago are living in two different worlds.
Yep.
Okay.
This is a curious one.
Why don't you field your own question back? I think you can do it better than
I'm
that.
sorry, sure. If I get help me out. If I get.
There you go.
When I saw your child playing the computer game, I assume the other kids have also played the computer games as well. Have you measured the impact of testosterone on winning in the computer games?
No, but that was a suggestion I had for a graduate student in psychology at the University of Missouri, and he did that, and he did it with coalitions using undergraduates. And that paper was just published in Evolutionary Human Behavior. And the results are that if your coalition wins, your T levels go up.
Your coalition wins a video game.
Yeah. So like in Call of Duty, you know, your team wins, your T levels go up.
We already know that it stimulates dopamine firing, and so that was my hunch that it would be so.
Yeah. You know, the interesting context here is not just winning, but the coalition.
Yeah.
And there are also some interesting individual differences in the role that you play in your coalition and then what your endocrine response is to the victory.
How so?
The key player, I mean, some individuals are just more involved and wrapped up in the outcomes. And they're the ones that show more responsivity. But also the role that you played in your team's victory is significant. So, you know, if you were the hero, your T level rises more than if you weren't. Tony, I've been waiting a long time, I'm sorry.
I agree that grandparents and adult parents in general are really important. Do they mediate any of these relationships, in particular for the problem adolescents, in terms of the cortisol level? If you've got a strong grandparent level, it's less of an effect or anything like that?
If you have strong parents and strong grandparents, you didn't get into that problem behavior adolescent group. So I've got a zero cell. Grandparents are really important in this culture, really, really important.
So there are kids who suffered similar circumstances and just stay out of that cell because they grew up
Yep.
with the grandparents?
Yep.
We should segue to a more general discussion, so people could feel free to address their questions to any of our speakers or to make comments. Or,
There might be one more
Can I
burning
just
question.
ask one
Yeah.
more? I'm very fascinated by this, the role of the grandparents in thinking about even the young people today whose extended families are not close. Did you see, or do you see in the village that other people play that role as pseudo-grandparents or whatever? And is it the biological connection?
Everyone's kind of worried about everyone else's children to some extent, but it's very unusual for particularly an older female or an older male to take on a grandparental role for children that aren't their grandchildren. You often find middle-aged women trading childcare because it's really important when you have to work and maybe take a job somewhere else to have someone you can rely upon to take care of your kids. And so often middle-aged women, 20, 30-year-old, 40-year-old women have very important reciprocal networks with their friends, their cousins that look after their kids. But I'd be surprised in those situations if I were measuring a woman who's taking care of someone else's children, if I saw the same kind of hormonal response with the affiliative hormones. I could be wrong. It'll be an interesting empirical question.
It'll be interesting because one of the things that when we think about what makes a difference to high-risk kids, we think about those caring external adults who may or may not be family members. So that's what I was asking.
Yeah, I think in terms of setting a model, when I look at kin and family and their importance here, they provide stability and predictability for these children. And you might expect that evolutionarily because there's the overlap of interests. So in general, a child can trust a parent in a way that they can't trust someone who's not related to them. There's that overlap of reproductive interest. And so I think kids are probably able to assess to some degree whether someone is trying to help them. So yeah, here we are in this society, what do we do? Because we've got grandparents in Arizona and grandkids in New Jersey, and everybody's kind of blown around. And you have disrupted neighborhoods. People that have migrated from Mexico and their grandparents aren't here. What can we do? And can we use older people to help out in terms of setting